webinar on reducing corporate food waste, an engagement guide for investors, hosted by ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. Celebrating its 45th year, ICCR is the pioneer coalition of shareholder advocates who view the management of their investments as a catalyst for social change. Its 300 member organizations comprise faith communities, socially responsible asset managers, unions, pensions, NGOs, and other socially responsible investors, with a combined assets of over $200 billion. Joined by close to 100 investor participants today, presenters Joanne Berkenkamp and Alan Pierce will provide an overview of their investor briefing paper, Assess Corporate Performance on Food Waste Reduction, a strategic guide for investors, which you can download via the handout tabs on your webinar panel. They will cover the causes and consequences of food waste, principal risks that wasting food holds for food companies, and what investors should look for and ask about in assessing the performance of your holdings on food waste. We will also take a look at some practical examples of what corporate leadership looks like in the food waste arena. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please enter your questions in the questions box as they come up. I'll take a minute here now to introduce our speakers. Joanne Berkenkamp is Senior Advocate Food and Ag of the Food and Ag Program at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. She focuses on improving the efficiency of the U.S. food system by reducing food waste from farm to fork. She specializes in food waste prevention and food rescue through industry-based approaches, consumer education, and policy advocacy. Joanne has nearly 2 decades of experience working in the food systems arena, including regional food systems development, public education, institutional food procurement, and food supply chain research and development. Alan Pierce is a member of Trillium Asset Management's shareholder advocacy team, where he engages companies on numerous issues, including sustainable agriculture and raw material sourcing, deforestation, and ethical business practices. He has led Trillium's work on food waste and collaborated with industry partners to engage several companies on this crucial topic. We are grateful to have these 2 experts lead us on our webinar today. And now I'll turn things over to Joanne, who will kick things off by describing the consequences of wasted food.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Alan and I wrote this paper on assessing corporate performance on food waste reduction with the goal, really, of helping position investors to feel like they're on top of the food waste issue, to understand it, and to understand how it can be incorporated into your assessments of corporations' financial performance and environmental performance. So we hope that this report and our webinar today will really kind of arm you with the information that you need to incorporate these issues into your professional lives and into your personal lives as well. So we're going to talk a little bit, as Nadira said, first about food waste as an issue, and then how it plays out in the corporate spheres and how it can interrelate with your work. And then we'll try to touch base with some ideas at the end about how you can incorporate some of these issues into your personal lives if you would like to talk about that as well. So let's jump into the next slide. Nadir, if you can advance that, and I'll talk a little bit about food waste as an issue nationally. So as you can see here, about 40% of food in the United States goes uneaten. So when you combine together everything that we grow and produce in the United States, and you add imports and you take out exports, about 40% of that goes to waste. It's a huge number. This is a figure that was developed by NRDC before I joined the organization, actually, in 2012. And when that number came out and was released, it really, I think, did a lot to elevate this issue nationally. The media just could not get enough of it. And I think you've seen, if you're watching media and social media, that this issue of food waste has really kind of risen in public awareness in the last few years because the number is so big, the cost is so large. You can see here that the value of that food is about $218 billion per year, and the consequence of that is, occurring from farms, through corporations, through consumers, really all the way through the value chain. So on the next slide, I've shown here a few illustrations of the types of things that are getting wasted. Thanks for advancing that, Nadira. So you can see here about 20% of the milk and meat in the U.S. food supply doesn't get eaten. With grains, it's closer to 40%. There's a lot of bread and baked items out there that are produced and not eaten. With seafood, it's actually about 50%. And as you can see along the bottom, more than 52% of our fruits and vegetables don't get consumed, which is kind of a crazy thing when you think about it, because a lot of resources go into producing these items, and particularly with things like fruits and vegetables, nearly all of us need to be eating more of those foods than we in fact consume. So there are a lot of consequences to this food being produced and not consumed. So on the next slide, I've shown for you here some of the examples of the environmental consequences of producing food that we don't eat. So about 21% of the fresh water that's used in the United States every year goes to grow food that we don't eat. Agriculture as a whole is more like 75 or 80% of water use. About 21% of all our water use is in fact tied to food that we don't eat. Wasted food represents about 21% of what goes into landfills. It's the largest single type of material that goes into landfills across the country. And of course, once you landfill material like food or yard waste, other organic material, it releases methane and adds to our greenhouse gas challenges. And then about 19% of cropland and 18% of fertilizer, again, are used to grow food that we don't eat. So there are a lot of consequences on the land and water from this. And then one of the statistics that I think is particularly powerful is you can see in red there that the emissions associated with producing food that we don't eat is equivalent to about 37 million cars. That's about one vehicle in 7. That's represented by the emissions with food that we don't eat. So it's very much a greenhouse gas and climate change issue as well, and I think that's often under-recognized, and it's something that needs to be reflected as you all think about the carbon footprint of the companies, the stocks in which you have holdings. So if you look at the next slide, on this issue about landfilling, about 95% of the wasted food that goes into municipal solid waste goes either to landfill or incineration and is burned. A very small portion, about 5%, goes into composting, and a fraction of that goes into anaerobic digestion, which is another form of disposal. So we have a really significant problem with wasting too much food and not disposing of it effectively. So if you move into the next slide, there are also important social dimensions to the issue of food that goes to waste. And as you can see here, if we could reduce the amount of food that we waste by just 15%, it would be enough to feed 25 million people their entire diet. So in the United States now, we have about 42 million people who are food insecure, who are missing some portion of their 3 meals a day. So to me, this slide really depicts both kind of a tragedy, a moral tragedy, that we're wasting so much in the face of so much need, but also at the same time, kind of a message of hope that if we can do better with channeling, with first reducing the amount of food that we're wasting, but then channeling surplus foods to people in need, we could make an enormous dent on reducing food insecurity in our country. So it's both, I think, kind of the challenge and the silver lining that we have before us. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Alan, and he's going to talk a little bit about this paper and where this intersects with the work of investors like yourselves.
Alan, are you there?
Oh, have we lost Alan?
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go. Thanks, Alan. You can take it from
sorry.
here.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne, for the introduction, and Nadir for hosting us today. Sorry, I was having a little bit of phone trouble this morning. Joanne just provided us with a great overview of the issue and the consequences associated with wasted food, which is also included as the first part of this new paper. But then we wanted to take it a little bit deeper and say how this impacts the companies that investors might be actually investing in, and also why this matters directly to investors. So at a high level, we think that shareholders should be concerned with how the companies they're investing in are managing food waste, including how they're working to manage those environmental and social impacts, but also the direct financial impacts. we'll get into that more in just a minute. But we feel that investors should be working to determine how a company is, if a company is considering food waste as a cost of doing business, which is unfortunately the historical norm, or if a company is proactively trying to do something about it. And of course, a necessary element for investors is disclosure, especially around material risks, which we certainly think food waste is, given the magnitude of the problem that Joanne just identified. So, but thus far, there's frequently a lack of standardized and adequate disclosure. So that's basically making food waste assessments a challenge for investors. So we wanted to provide this guide really as an enabler. We hope that this will encourage investors to incorporate food waste into their analyses, but also to engage companies to continue to improve their disclosures around food waste management, as well as the actual strategies they're using. Okay, so I see we're on the next slide. So the paper really summarizes 4 main factors. The first one we've talked about is really the consequences of wasting food, but then we sort of branch that into how those consequences present risks to businesses. So we've talked about 4 main business risks that we've identified. But then we also wanted to make this paper actionable. So we've included some guidance and insight into how companies should be prioritizing their food waste management strategies. So in other words, we've sort of identified strategies that investors should be looking for from company disclosures. And then finally, and encouragingly, we're really starting to see a lot of progress from some companies. We're seeing some really creative and interesting solutions that companies have taken to manage their food waste more responsibly. And so we've highlighted several examples that we could call best in class of what companies are doing to manage their excess food. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Start off with looking at some of the business risks. So we've really identified 4 main risks. The first one that investors, of course, will be concerned with is financial risk, but we've identified some others that are also very important. And as I'm sure, all familiar, these other risks, supply chain, reputational, and regulatory risk, in addition to posing their own risks, they do also present financial risk. So these really all do come back to why this is important for investors to be looking at food waste. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to jump right into a little bit deeper, closer look at financial risk. So for a little more context, the refed analysis, which some of you are probably familiar with from last year, showed that grocery retailers or the supermarkets, restaurants, and food service companies waste food valued at $57 billion per year. So that's, shows that for this sector, for the industry as a whole, there's a huge financial risk here. But what we as investors need to figure out is how much is any individual company that we might be investing in, how much are they wasting and how much is it costing them? So it's clear that food is very expensive. You see, for the restaurant sector, it typically represents about 1/3 of all their operating costs. And another example of how those costs can really affect the bottom line of a company, in the institutional food service sector, that's the big food service providers like Compass Group and Aramark, between 4 and 10% of purchased food is wasted before it's ever sold. So that's basically a company wasting up to 10% of their costs directly. So these are really big costs, and that's just the purchasing costs. We're not even talking about the other costs associated with transportation, processing, marketing. There's a lot of labor costs associated, paying people to cook the food and handle it and refrigerate it, etc. So these costs can all really add up. And finally, there's also disposal costs. As Joanne mentioned earlier, 95% of food is going directly to waste. And in the last 30 years or so, food waste or landfill costs have doubled. So it's really, these costs are continuing to rise, which is a big deal for companies. But one silver lining is that it doesn't have to be this way. There was a recent study done by WRI and the Champions 12.3 group that surveyed 1,200 different business sites. And what they found was that for every dollar invested in food waste reduction efforts, it yielded an average return of $14. So there really is an opportunity here for those companies that are managing their financial risk. Okay, and then the next slide. Okay, so just the other risks, I'll touch on each of them briefly here. Supply chain risks, which may not seem completely intuitive at first, but I think it will be pretty easy to see how this could manifest itself. So, for example, if we're to imagine volatile weather conditions, could really affect farmers. It can drive up costs for farmers. It can decrease yields, or in some cases even lead to crop failure. So these can be serious risks that are likely to be exacerbated even more in the future by climate change. So really, it can also be thought of this way. The more a company wastes, the more the supply chain needs to produce, which is just going to be increasingly risky and expensive. So what this means for food businesses is that they really need to be efficient in their use of food and try to maximize the available production. That will help ensure supply chain stability. And that's a much preferred alternative than trying to demand more food production from agricultural systems that are already strained. Reputational risk. I think we're all familiar with how this has happened for companies in different sectors and different areas. But one way it can be playing out here around food waste is leaders and laggards are really starting to develop as companies are taking action and communicating their goals around food waste reduction. And that's never a good thing. If you're investing in a company that might be seen as a laggard, that's never good when consumers have more information at their fingertips and are increasingly demanding more responsible business practices. And finally, the regulatory risk. We've seen some bills introduced at the federal level, but more immediately impactful have been a number of state-level landfill bans, which are basically requiring companies to divert their food waste away from landfill. And it means they have to compost it or send it to an anaerobic digestion facility or some other means rather than saying it's a landfill. And one company that we've talked to called the state law in California a game changer. The company was unprepared to divert their food waste away from landfill, so they found it a big challenge to change their practices, and they found it costly to enable their business as a whole to be able to meet the regulation. So that's just another source of risk that can and has been manifesting itself. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joanne to talk a little bit about how a company should proceed given the risk and consequences.
Great. So where do you go with this? What do you ask for from companies as you try to increase accountability around food waste and the consequences on their businesses and their environmental footprint? So prioritization is key. There are a lot of things that you can do around food waste, but you really want to focus on the ones that can have most impact. So this diagram here on the right has been used since the 1970s. It was developed by EPA, and it really tells us a lot about how to focus. So you can see at the top of this, source reduction is the place to begin. That's the most preferred strategy to begin with in addressing food that gets wasted. So source reduction involves things like preventing food waste in the first place. So if you're a food service management company or a restaurant, you're preparing food in the kitchen, trying to reduce the amount of food that you buy but then aren't able to sell. That would be one example. Or having your customers not throw out as much of the food that they're served. right? That's a way of preventing that food from going to waste in the first place. And that's where you get, fortunately, both the strongest savings for businesses, and it's also where you get the environmental benefits that are achieved when that food is not produced in the first place and shipped and packaged and so forth. So source reduction is always the place where you want to start. And as we talk a little bit later in the webinar about examples of corporate leadership, we'll show you some more examples of what that actually looks like on the ground. So prevention is the place to start. Then as you move down this hierarchy, you can see the blue band. The next one there is feeding hungry people. So if you have food that's being generated but can't be sold by a business, the next best strategy is to donate it to food banks or soup kitchens, whatnot, so that people do actually have access to that food and are able to eat it, given the very significant challenges we have around food insecurity. After that, it would be priorities like industrial uses, rendering of meat products, things like fuel conversion, biofuels for oil, for instance, from making French fries, and then things like animal feed. So in the manufacturing sector, many of the big food processors take a lot of their waste from manufacturing and they divert it to animal feed, which is great. It's much better than having it end up in the landfill. And then you move into things like composting. So that's kind of the hierarchy. As I mentioned earlier with that slide with the trash truck, unfortunately, about 95% of our solid waste, in fact, ends up at the bottom of this pyramid, being either landfilled or incinerated. So the basic message is prioritizing is key and prevention is where you want to start. So if you move on to the next slide, I've shown a little bit of data here just relative to greenhouse gas emissions about why that food recovery hierarchy, that triangular image, is so important. So this shows you in kind of a technical way the greenhouse gas benefits that you get from different approaches to managing food waste. So you can see at the top of this, prevention, which avoids the production and shipping and transportation and packaging and chilling of that food before it gets wasted. That avoids about 420 metric tons of carbon equivalents per 100 tons of food that's wasted. So prevention is the best thing you can do relative to greenhouse gas emissions. And then you can see with some of these other strategies, they're improvements over landfilling, they're less of an improvement. So really, it's interesting that we often hear people say, well, I don't want to waste food because I'm composting. And my response to that is, hey, it's great that you're composting. You're doing a better job of dealing with the food that gets wasted, but it would be better if you didn't waste it in the first place. And that applies at the corporate level as well. So if you move on to the next slide, we'll talk now a little bit about what really strong corporate leadership looks like. We've identified 4 critical areas for action. And these are the kinds of things that you want to be talking with your holdings about, whether they're doing these things, how they could do them better. So here are the things that we believe to be the key priorities. First is measuring the current volumes and causes of wasted food. So we often hear from companies, we don't waste food. I hear that all the time. And it's fascinating when businesses actually start to measure how much food is going to waste and what it's costing them. They really change their understanding, they change their thinking, and they get a whole lot more motivated to start thinking about what to do about that. So measurement is really the starting point for everything. And sometimes we hear concerns that, measurement is expensive, it would take us a huge investment to measure all of our food waste. And, my response to that really is measurement on a pilot basis is fantastic. That is a great starting point. You don't have to measure everything. You don't have to spend 2 years figuring out how to do your measurement. Start with doing some measurements on a pilot basis, and that is a great way to get you started. Secondly, developing and implementing food waste management strategies. And there are a variety that we'll talk through in a moment. I think the point that Alan raised about the return on investment from food waste strategies is really important. As he mentioned, the World Resources Institute recently put out a study that showed that the median return on investment from a very wide range of food waste strategies was 14 to 1. So of all the strategies that they looked at, all the companies, initiatives that they looked at, half of those initiatives had a return on investment higher than 14 to 1. Half had a return on investment lower than 14 to 1, and almost none of them had a negative ROI. So, companies will have different preferences about where to start. I think anywhere they start is good and to be encouraged, and that the economic benefit from doing a wide range of things is actually quite strong and is increasingly well documented. So thirdly, we need them to establish and publicly disclose quantifiable goals for food waste reduction, benchmarks, and KPIs on the pathway to achieving those goals. And then lastly, we look for public disclosure of data and progress on what they're doing. So let's move next into the first of these on the next slide, measuring current volumes and causes of food that's going to waste. So there's some really great examples of this. Stop and Shop is kind of a classic example that we use. As a grocery retailer, they saved about $100 million per year after they assessed losses in their perishables departments. So fruits and vegetables, meats, dairy, that kind of thing. And it led them to realize how much was going to waste, what the causes were, and they did some fairly simple things around, for instance, how they show and display fruits and vegetables in their produce departments. And that helped them be putting less produce out, to be changing some of the things, the practices around how they stock that and rotate inventory, things like that, and it saved them $100 million a year. So it's a great example of innovation in the grocery sector. Among large food service management companies, a company like Aramark has done a very interesting thing recently. They're the third largest food service management company. They did a pilot study of waste measurement in their kitchens. So that would be considered pre-consumer waste. It's food that hasn't yet been served to people, that it is being worked with in the kitchen and then is being discarded for whatever reason. They started measuring their pre-consumer waste, and they found that in the course of several months, they could reduce it by 36%, which is a huge number in terms of costs that were dropping to their bottom line that they can now avoid. So that pilot study led them now to set up this initiative where they're going to introduce this Lean Path food waste management tracking system to 500 of their largest accounts in 2017. So I think it's a great example of how measurement really helped them understand the consequences of wasting food and the scale of it, and now they've really embraced this measurement effort very actively. And then lastly, food service firms that use this Lean Path software, where you actually weigh and photograph all the waste that's all the food that's going to waste in industrial kitchen settings, that has been shown to reduce pre-consumer waste by up to 50% in a year. And that, again, drops straight to the bottom line. So let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about strategies for actually developing and implementing food waste management efforts. So here are a few examples of some really innovative things that have been done. So Walmart has improved forecasting of their demand for food, packaging efforts, and in-store display formats to reduce losses with fruits and vegetables. They've eliminated about 7 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions across their supply chains from these types of innovations. So that's, I think, a really great example of how they really looked at the supply chain as a whole and figured out where they could make a difference. Another example is that Compass Group USA and Sodexo, which are the first and second largest food service management companies in the country, they're participating in the Save the Food campaign. That's actually an effort that's led by my organization, NRDC, and the Ad Council. And it's a national consumer campaign to help individuals and families understand the scale and consequences of wasting food, and to arm consumers with ways that they can change that reality in their homes. So Compass and Sodexo are collaborating with us on that work, and they will be putting up, for instance, signage in their corporate cafeterias and hospitals and colleges to educate their own consumers about how they can be part of the solution. A wide range of national restaurant chains and grocery chains have been working actively on food donation. So for instance, many restaurant chains in particular that have prepared food that they can donate have worked through an organization called Food Donation Connection. Since 1992, Food Donation Connection has orchestrated the donation of about 500 million pounds of mainly prepared food to connect those chains like Darden and others with people in need in communities around the country. And it's a really great illustration of the fact that donation of food currently is already happening at scale in the grocery sector and the restaurant sector, and we need to continue growing that and invite additional types of businesses to expand their donations. And then lastly, in terms of managing the waste that can't be avoided, Stop and Shop, again, has established an anaerobic digester, which is a technology for managing food waste and keeping it out of landfill. That anaerobic digester up in the northeast part of the United States can process 95 tons of food per day and generate up to 40% of the energy needed for a very large distribution center. So that's a great way that they're using to keep that material out of landfill. So let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about establishing benchmarks, and I'm going to turn that one over to Alan.
So once a company is measuring and has management strategies in place, we believe it's important for companies to set goals and performance indicators to be able to demonstrate how effective its programs are. And starting off, about 18 months ago, the USDA and EPA set a national food waste reduction target, and that goal was to reduce food waste 50% by 2030. And that really set the foundation for this announcement by founding companies that committed to reduce food waste 50% by 2030 in what is now known as the Champions Program. And you'll see the companies who founding companies listed there have really big names in there. I mean, if Unilever, Sodexo, General Mills, Walmart, Yum Brands are committing to reduce food waste, it really makes you wonder what in your portfolio are doing, if they have some sort of program or goal around food waste reduction or not. And I think, unfortunately, more often than not, we'll find that companies don't yet have this kind of goal. Similarly, we also have seen the Consumer Goods Forum commit to cut food waste in half by 2025, and it's a little bit more of a global membership base in the Consumer Goods Forum, but there's over 400 companies, a lot of big food manufacturers, retailers, and some restaurants, maybe to a little bit lesser extent, but big companies that are also committed to cut food waste in half. So those are the big, impressive goals that, some companies, that's the approach that some companies take. But we've seen other types of goals as well. For example, the Bon Appetit example here, they're a subsidiary of Compass Group, who's one of the largest food service providers. And they have a goal for 80% of their sites to be donating food by 2018, which that's really great for a big form of waste for a company like that. Really comes from unserved food. It's prepared but didn't get sold or served, and so donating that food is really a great use for it. So that's just a few examples of goals that we're seeing that are all really shaping the landscape for what we expect to see in the future. And then let's go to the next slide and get to the last step here of what we think companies should be doing in terms of taking action. And it's important to note here that publicly disclosing data doesn't need to be the last step. We're not necessarily envisioning these 4 areas for action as a stepwise model. We think it would be important for companies to be disclosing how they're thinking about food waste. We want to see this start to improve and start to happen as soon as possible. So it'd be great if companies were, even if they don't have data yet, to be disclosing how they view the issue and what they want to do. If that, even if that means starting a pilot assessment this year, even before they get data, we want to see how they're talking about it. But then some examples of companies who are really doing this well. Tesco in 2014, they've published data about their full absolute value of food waste generated, and this data has been audited by a third party, so it's reliable data. And having that figure of the absolute food waste that the company generates is really an important data point. We can then understand as investors how the company is going to improve year over year by having that data point. And they're committed to continuing to publish that, and they already have, at least for 15 as well. Example to is Kroger, that publishes in their sustainability report a breakdown of the quantity of food discarded, or well, basically all of their food in line with the food recovery hierarchy. So they, at the top, they say how much they've donated, and then they break it down further by the tons of food that was diverted to animal feed, industrial uses, and composting. So that's a nice visual demonstration of how the company is working to manage food waste. And then finally, as Joanne said, many companies have food donation programs in place, often through a third-party organization like Food Donation Connection or Feeding America. And we've seen companies disclose data on their food donation programs specifically. So they might say we donated 50 million pounds of food last year, but they don't contextualize that in terms of the total food waste they've generated. So we don't have a sense yet for many companies of how much food waste they're really generating and how they're handling it, other than this one data point on donation programs. So again, I think that's an example of something that we want to highlight. Is it's great that you have this donation program in place, but we need additional information. We need additional disclosure. So as we go to the next slide then, just to start to wrap up here, I want to say that we've identified, kind of throughout this report, some suggestions for what investors can do and how they should be incorporating this information. So the first point really is to explicitly look for food waste information, incorporate that into research processes and dialogues with companies. And a lot of times companies may not have a lot of information around their food waste management programs yet, but as they start to hear about it from investors, as investors ask those questions and start to demand data, it really will be an important step in improving the disclosures across the board. Investors should also be looking to evaluate how the food waste practices of the companies that they're investing in contribute to the company's broader environmental impact accounting. So that includes things like their greenhouse gas and water footprints. As we said at the outset, there really are tremendous consequences for wasting food, and we would like to see companies start to evaluate how wasting food contributes to their other environmental impacts. And then thirdly, we'd like to see demonstrations of how companies are tracking their food waste, how they're measuring it, and how they're minimizing the costs and risks. And finally, how they're taking advantage of related opportunities that might come from managing some of those risks. And that could be done from any number of ways, but really starting to get some disclosure around this, around how the company can talk about food waste and how they can demonstrate what they're doing, is really an important step. And finally, if completely striking out, if companies are not either willing to engage or not demonstrating any progress, then shareholder resolutions can be an effective tool to raise the bar a little bit and elevate the level of importance from a company's perspective to manage food waste. Let's go to the next slide. So lastly, as we really intended to make this paper as actionable as possible, so we included a list of engagement questions as an appendix that we hope will be able to serve as sort of a guide or a template for entering into conversations or a dialogue with a food-based business. So I've put a couple of examples here, but the questions we've outlined really get at some of the key elements of this paper. We're trying to make it actionable. So, for example, if measuring its food, managing that waste, and minimizing food purchase, that question right there touches on a lot of the issues that we've talked about. And again, the other question there is what systems are in place to keep food out of landfills or incinerators, for instance, by diverting it. And that really, that type of question, and there's more examples in the paper, but it gets at the management strategies of, how can a company be really working to better address its food waste. So let's go to the next slide. So thank you. I guess that's really what we wanted to present today. We have our contact emails here. I'm happy to talk about this more offline or after the webinar today, so please reach out to us. We have another link there to download the paper. But I will turn it back over to Nadira now to corral some of your questions for the day.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanne and Alan, for this presentation and for the briefing paper. And again, I've included the briefing paper as a handout that you'll find on your webinar panel. So yes, let's turn now to some questions. And if you have a question, please enter it into the question box on your panel. So we've got a few that's come in already, so I'll start from the top. One from Gabby Bastos. Can you explain more specifically how food waste reduction would directly result in a decrease in food security?
Sure. So this is Joanne.
And the follow-on, what's the step that seems to be missing between food waste reduction and distribution to those less fortunate?
Yes. Okay. This is a great question. So you remember when I presented that triangular image, that food waste hierarchy? The place we always want to start is with preventing food from going to waste in the first place, right? Where you get the cost savings and you get the maximum environmental benefits. There will be situations where you can't prevent that food waste from occurring. So for instance, if you're running a restaurant, you will want to make sure that you have enough of certain things. You will always have certain amounts of overproduction. For instance, grocery stores do want to keep their shelves fully stocked. Some of that product is not going to get sold and will be pulled. So there are situations where food waste can't be fully prevented. In those situations, you want to make sure that it does get eaten if possible, if it's appropriate for food donation. So we encourage people to think first about the prevention and then to move into the donation phase. And they are different things, certainly. I'm often asked, if prevention efforts are really successful, will there be less food that could be donated to people in need? Could that be a bad thing? And that's conceivable. It's possible that food waste prevention efforts would be so successful that you would actually bump up against food that's being donated. But my sense generally is that there is so much being wasted now. There is so much potential for both prevention and donation that I don't think those two things are going to bump up with each other, with one another at a macro level anytime soon. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for companies to do both, and we want to encourage them to do both. And I think often, donation channels are pretty well established in the grocery and manufacturing sectors. They're not as well established for prepared foods like restaurants and institutional environments like colleges and hotels. But some of these companies like Darden Restaurants are really showing that there's plenty of room to donate and that those systems can be built to accommodate that.
Great, thanks, Joanne.
That was great. Can I just add one thing there?
Of course.
Yeah.
I would just add that with donations, I think one of the limitations is that companies are frequently donating packaged goods and baked goods. They're more of the shelf-stable things that might have just hit some arbitrary date label of expiration, but they may not be donating fresh food. I think we see much more. Very commonly we see that companies, if the food has to be refrigerated, that presents a big obstacle. So if it's more perishable, that food is much less often donated. And I think that's another area where there's really room to expand that, even as companies work to reduce or prevent food waste from happening. There's also a lot of opportunity to donate different types of food.
Yeah,
Okay,
great
thank
point.
you, Alan. A question from Tracy. I'm already hearing from one company that they don't really have any food waste. I push back with, how do you know if you haven't yet measured it? What's the right response for companies giving us this line?
That's such a great question. I hear that all the time too. I mean, I think you asked the right question. How do you know you're not wasting food if you're not measuring it? And you know, I mean, basically my sense is unless they are way ahead of the curve and are already measuring and on top of their situation, I think it's quite unlikely that they are not wasting food. And some of it is just built into the system. It's how it works. You can't always reduce all of it, but I think it's probably not very plausible that they are not wasting food. So I would just encourage you to kind of stick with your guns and ask them to document that. Alan, do you have any other you know, pressure points on that?
No, you know, that I agree. That is a question that, or a response that we get quite frequently, and I don't know that there's a better response to that. You know, it's basically like, prove it. You know, what's in it? You know, what would be the harm of you demonstrating that you have no waste? And you know, companies really don't have much of a response. They just say, well, we optimize our purchasing, we do this, we do that, but we haven't actually measured how much waste we have. And that, to me, still seems like an evasive response. And I think we just need to push further and just say, really demonstrate, we're concerned that you're incurring costs and that you should be doing more.
Okay, thanks, Alan. And I think sometimes we're hearing a bit of an echo on the line, so audience, just bear with us. From Carly, is the USDA and EPA Champions Program still intact given the new administration?
It is still intact. You know, I think we're all waiting to see what happens at you know, particularly EPA and also USDA. It is there. You know, these 15 big companies that Alan mentioned have signed on and embraced that goal, and they did it in a very public, collective way. You know, to make the point that they are on board and they support this. You know, who knows what the Trump administration will do? I think the political reality that we're in makes it all the more important that some of these companies who are in fact leaders step forward and keep saying this is the right thing to do, and our businesses benefit, our communities benefit, the environment benefits, our shareholders benefit, and that's why our business is committed to this. So we'll see. You know, NRDC keeps very close tabs on all that, but we're clearly in a period of uncertainty.
And I think those companies.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alan.
I don't think they're necessarily making that commitment specifically because the goal was created. I think they're doing this because they see it as the right thing to do for their business. And even if, you know, the official program goes away, I think these companies, I think it's very likely that they would stay committed to this goal. So I think we'll still be able to hold these companies up as examples of leaders for having made this commitment. And I would be very surprised if they reneged on that commitment, even if the program goes away or if something changes at the administration level.
Mm-hmm. And given too the Consumer Goods Forum pledge as well outside of the USDA and EPA. A couple of other questions that have come in. What are the characteristics of companies who are not prepared to address food waste? For example, breakdown of large, medium, small companies, large chains versus franchising, market cap, etc. We have a sense of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's interesting. I mean, I would say the companies that really are focused on measurement and who don't assume that wasting food is just a necessary cost of business are the ones who are much better positioned to get on top of the issue. So it's the folks who are saying we don't waste food that you're hearing from. I mean, you know, you kind of know what ensues from that perspective. I don't know that it's necessarily tied to size. I mean, certainly some large corporations, have extremely rigorous distribution systems, for instance, very sophisticated monitoring systems, and yet even in those circumstances, we still see food going to waste. There are problems that occur in any system. So I don't know if you can sort of categorize who's better or less aware or better or less positioned to address it. Alan, do you have any insight on that?
I would just add that it could be I guess there could be different advantages and smaller companies. Maybe a smaller company might be able to work more closely or tailor more individual or local. If they're more in just one region, if they're a smaller business, they might be able to work with farmers, local farmers, to provide some of the waste to feed animals, for example. Where a big national chain, establishing those individual partnerships might be a little bit trickier because it takes just there's an extra level of management needed there. But at the same time, or on the opposite end there, the big businesses might be able to justify investing in a anaerobic digestion facility or in a larger composting facility, or they might be able to partner with other large businesses to help build some of those almost more or the larger CapEx type of investments needed to handle some of the waste. And it could even be like to invest in refrigerated trucks to donate food, where that might be a bigger challenge for a small business. So I don't know that a large or a small business is necessarily more susceptible to risks. I think there's just different opportunities for ways to manage the waste.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that, I think in some cases there is a geographic component to this. So there are a number of states, maybe half a dozen states, for instance, that now ban large food waste generators from landfilling food waste, and in some cases other organic material. And that has really pushed the companies in those states to find alternatives to landfilling. And it not only pushes them to, for instance, take the waste they have and move it into composting, but it's really pushing them to look at the top of the hierarchy and say, how do we prevent it in the first place? How do we do more with donation? And so, for instance, Vermont is one of the states that has a landfill ban. After that was put in place, they saw a 40% increase in the amount of food being donated into food banks in the state of Vermont. So some of those regulatory changes can be quite powerful. You see that also in California. They don't have a landfill ban, but they do have mandatory recycling, which is kind of a permutation on that. And it really is pushing companies to find alternatives. So when Alan was talking about some of these risks that businesses face, that regulatory risk at the state level is, something companies really need to be cognizant of. It seems like the pace of change is accelerating a little bit in terms of states having difficulties with finding enough landfill space and landfilling becoming more expensive. The tipping fees to actually go dump material at a landfill has really risen across the United States, and particularly in high population density areas like the Northeast, where those costs have particularly shot up, and it increases the financial incentives for businesses to find alternatives.
Good. A couple of other questions here that have come in. One from Tom. In the area of prevention, wouldn't it be helpful for corporations to use their positions to steer behavior away from excess meat and dairy use? Although the food waste ratio is lower than other categories, the upfront water and energy needed to produce meat and dairy are 10 to 15 times that of other sources on a calorie basis. It would seem to me that reduction of meat and dairy would significantly lower GHG in water usage.
Yep, that's absolutely true. If you look at something like beef, I think you all probably know it's one among the highest greenhouse gas emission foods out there per calorie. NRDC uses a chart relative to water use for food that gets wasted, and we have an example that shows the number of shower minutes that are associated with wasting different quantities of food. So if you waste, for instance, beer or chocolate, the water that's associated with that is very limited. If you waste a pound of beef, it's the water equivalent of letting your shower run for 6 hours. You know, beef is absolutely the highest impact, along, you know, with other meats and dairy as well. So yeah, the caller is absolutely right about that. So that's a great place to prioritize.
Mm-hmm. Another question in from Jody: has portion control ever been a suggestion for reducing waste? I.e., if you're selling half loaves of bread in restaurants, how much food do they put in on the plate?
Yeah, that's such a great question.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Yeah, do you want to take that, Alan?
Yeah, sure.
First?
I think that definitely has been. I think some companies have even sort of highlighted their portion control strategies, ways to reduce food waste. So, for example, Panera, that offers you can order just a half of a sandwich, is one way that they've at least told me that that's how they're working to reduce waste. So that's just one example. It definitely is, and another way we're seeing that is there's been a campaign in food service a little bit, especially at universities, to offer trayless dining. So that's basically you can't get a tray, you through a plate, so much food, and it's really shown the amount of food that people take, and then consequently they often take a lot more than they can eat. So it's also really reduced waste, and that's been done at a number of universities in food service. Of how portion control has worked. Another angle on that, maybe for the manufacturers and some of the retailers, is different types of packaging. You know, as you mentioned, maybe selling half loaves of bread. But companies are starting to experiment more with different packaging options, maybe that are more reusable, or some are even going so far as to try to put ethylene absorbing strips in a package, and ethylene is one of the gases that causes food to ripen, essentially, or basically to move towards rotting. So that would basically prolong the life of a product. So there are a number of ways doing that, and it's certainly, I think companies could really get really creative around how they try to portion things differently, package things differently to minimize the excess food, to minimize the waste, but also to extend the life of a product. And I guess the one more thought there would be around consumer education, because a lot of waste comes from consumer education, and this could be at a retailer or a restaurant. They could really work with, do some campaigns to say, well, this doesn't have to become waste. You can freeze things, or there's alternative preparation and storage methods for certain foods that can really also help to reduce waste. And that might be another way that they could sort of get around that, outside of actually changing the portion, but just if there's excess, if the portion's too large to be eaten in a short period of time, knowing that consumers could still save that food or store it differently to be able to use it throughout its life.
That's great,
Alan.
Ellen.
Anything to add there, Joanne?
Yeah, this is such a great question around portion control. And just to put this in context, in a restaurant environment or a food service environment like a college or a hospital, you basically have two kinds of food waste happening. One is the pre-consumer waste that happens in the kitchen, and the other is the post-consumer waste after the food has been served that happens, out in the restaurant or out in that, college dorm dining room kind of thing. And the relative proportion of pre-consumer and post-consumer waste in those contexts is not very well documented. But I think it's probably a reasonable guess that it's often somewhere around 75% of the food waste in restaurants and institutions is post-consumer waste, and only about 25% happens in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. So it's a big portion of the problem. It is a huge piece of the problem. So your caller has really, put her finger on something very important. So, NRDC has been engaged with some companies on this issue of portion sizing, and some, as Alan mentioned, are quite innovative. Others are going to be a tougher sell because their value proposition is all around large volumes of food, and if consumers throw half of it out, they're willing to live with it. The more innovative ones are identifying ways to offer different sizes. They're offering, you know, side dishes that are optional, asking people if you want the bread before you put it on the table, offering people half sizes, different approaches to how that food is served, you know, giving a smaller portion and then offering the client seconds. Some of those things can be really helpful strategies. So there's room for improvement on that very important issue.
Great. And as we're a little low on time, we have just one more question. What should investors look for in terms of internal management structures for addressing food waste? Who's responsible? Should we look for cross-departmental efforts? And thanks, Jeff, for asking that question.
Yeah, I can take that one. I'll try to be brief here because I know we're approaching the end. So I think it's similar to what we'd expect to see from a lot of different topics. I think we'd want to see a demonstration of how, I guess, a corporate direction. So something from the top, showing that, you know, senior management or executives are concerned with this as an issue, that they are really trying to drive efficiency in how food is used and optimally managed. And then I think you can also ask to see some sort of demonstration of how within a given business, a restaurant or company, that it really is that they are communicating. You know, in talking to Whole Foods, one of the things that I've learned is that the prepared foods, where they have their hot bars and their food that's prepared and put out ready to eat, and the produce sections, they don't really talk to each other. Where it would be very easy if there was excess produce, or say there were too many mangoes one day, that could be sent over to the kitchen, and they could try to incorporate something, or incorporate mangoes into an item they put out on the hot bars that day. But, you know, so it's kind of like there's a gap in communication there. And so that's at that's a management level question of, you know, how is food incorporated in different parts of the business? And I think that's sort of a management level question that can be asked. And I think often we'll find that companies don't really know. And so I guess that's just sort of a quick response to that. The management strategies, though, are again, it's going to be very company specific. So you know, some of it could also be the company's business model. Like Panera, again, they say that they do everything made to order rather than preparing foods in bulk in one area. And that's generally a much better way to minimize food waste. If you're to order as needed, that will reduce waste, rather than if you're preparing things in bulk, regardless of what the demand actually might be. So there are some strategies built in there that can help reduce waste.
Great, thanks, Alan. Thanks, everyone. What great questions and great presentation. So thanks very much to Joanne and Alan for walking us through that investor briefing paper. And again, it's available, so we encourage you all to use it. We encourage investors to take action on this topic and to join fellow ICCR members in engaging companies in your portfolio. So thanks, everyone. The recording will be available, and I'll send out that material right after our call today. Thanks again for joining.